Welcome back to The Layers We Live. I'm Dr. Loree Johnson, therapist, trainer, reproductive health advocate, and someone who's lived through more than a few layers herself. And around here, I'd like to think that we're talking about real stuff, the ways that our mental health, reproductive health, identity, grief, and healing are all intertwined in our everyday lives. And some of those most defining moments that we have, they're the ones that nobody sees and the ones that we often don't have words for. So this is our space to pull back the curtain, to get real and share the conversations that matter and the ones that don't always happen out loud. And today we're talking about a chapter in every woman and birthing person's life, and that is perimenopause. We don't have the language or the support often to navigate this. And it's often this long and unpredictable stretch of time before menopause. And I know that when I was growing up, there wasn't a lot of conversation about this quote unquote change of life. And we were just kind of left to fend for ourselves. And I like that the conversation is shifting and that we are shedding more light on something that is a very normal part of every birthing person's development. And today is my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Wiyatta Fahnbulleh. And Dr. Wiyatta is a licensed clinical forensic and reproductive psychologist who blends her clinical expertise with dynamic public engagement. And she shares her insights through speaking, publishing articles, blogs, digital content, podcast appearances like you see here, organizational training and consulting. She started her career in forensic psychology in the state and federal prisons before transitioning to private practice, where she now works with professional women who are facing career obstacles and major life transitions and fertility challenges. And so, Dr. Wiyatta, I'm so excited for you to be here today. Thank you so much.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I'm not going to say of that.
Thank you. I really wanted something that I think reflected the multiple layers that we often live with. And we're complex beings. And so I felt like it was a way to honor that level of complexity and that nuance. And I think that kind of dovetails nicely into what we're going to be talking about today, because we know this transition, it's not just a physical one. It's, multifaceted. It's hormonal. It's emotional. It's spiritual and even cultural. And it can also happen at a time where we're often juggling aging parents, careers, health shifts that just echo a lot of struggle and strength, but also resilience. Mm-hmm. And also, we know that in our community, in the Black community in particular, Black American community, there's a lot of silence around reproductive and emotional struggles. So I'm glad that we're going to be hopefully kind of demystifying the process, educating people and giving voice to what often goes silent. Yeah. So before we check in or kind of get into our conversation today, I just wanted to just ask you, how are you doing? How are you coming into today? I always just like to kind of get oriented and see how people are, just coming in. I know there's a lot going on in the world. And so I just want to do a little check-in. How are you doing?
So I'm doing okay. I mean, I'm a little under the weather, but I'm doing fine considering I had the weekend with my family. Like my nephew turned 3. My niece is turning 12. So I had 2 birthday parties this weekend. So it was just wonderful. It was amazing, and saw my parents. So it's been great. As far as the world, I'm trying to stay in positive spaces and surround myself with people like yourself who we can uplift each other and support each other and just hold each other up when we feel fragile, because there's a lot of fragility.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I like to hear that you are, I know that family is really important to you. And since you moved back east to be closer to your loved ones, and now you're able to spend so much more time with them, and I want to kind of take part in all of those, those family rituals that are so meaningful.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I am okay. I'm okay. I think the same. And I'm trying to lean into community and using that as a buffer to be the constant chaos that I feel like we're living through. And every day we wake up to something new that we have to reorient ourselves to. So it's definitely a process, but I'm cherishing the downtime that I have outside of work and, just being in community with the people that really uplift me, like you said, and also making sure that I maximize my time with my colleagues that also help me feel grounded because work is getting heavier. I think that we've been kind of talking a lot about that behind the scenes and just wanting to continue to own that, while we're having these powerful and very important conversations, we know it's happening in the backdrop of things that are outside of our control. And so just wanting to appreciate that layer as well, that is a part of all of us. Yeah. So as we kind of get into today and just really setting the stage, I'm wondering if you could just let our listeners know, what is perimenopause? I think people know what menopause is, but, what is perimenopause and, what are some of the early signs or changes that people might start to see in their bodies when they're going through this phase?
So basically perimenopause was that transitional period between from youthful, everything is going well, like, emotionally, physically, to that time before menopause. And like you said, it can last for several years because research is finding that it can start in your 30s. I originally thought, it's in your 50s, but it could start in your 30s when your hormones stop fluctuating. You start to notice this physiological symptoms, and they vary from person to person. I mean, we have the typical ones, which I'm sure we'll get into, but it varies from person to person and reaches, so it could be from the hot flash to the night sweats to weight gain and emotional, dysregulation, or from other symptoms that we don't even notice or talk about. The doctors don't really tell us about. We have to find out along the way.
Exactly. We have to find out along the way. And I feel like sometimes there are these surprising symptoms that also don't get talked about. And, and just to kind of maybe dovetail on what you said about the doctors not necessarily talking about it, I think I read somewhere that there might only be 2,500 OB-GYNs who have advanced training in menopause in general. This is not something that doctors typically study in medical school. And I think that's important information for listeners to know because we often think that our doctors are, they know everything. And yes, they know an encyclopedic amount of information. And yet you can still know a lot of information and still not know everything there is to know. And, and so, if they're not necessarily getting that training, how are professionals really guiding us through this phase of life?
Exactly.
Yeah. And, you mentioned some of the symptoms, like the hormonal shifts, some of the physical shifts. And do you think there are any kind of what do you think are some of the most maybe surprising symptoms that don't necessarily get talked about enough?
Heart palpitations, like some people talk about heart palpitations, joint pain. And I think, there's this narrative of, you're getting older. You just have joint pain, but that's linked to something else. Dizziness. Now, that's one of my symptoms, like dizziness. I didn't even realize dizziness was one of the symptoms, but you go to stand up and all of a sudden there's this wave of dizziness, that itching with what just happened. And it's so quick. So we miss that lump too. Vaginal dryness, during sex for some people, pelvic floor issues, not being the whole jerky, other things happening down in that, or you sneeze or you peeing, all of those things can be related to that. But then mental health wise, we talk about going from zero to rage, things that you can recognize later, why did I have that response to something that seems so minor? But it's that if your hormones are not balanced or not aligned, it can cause emotional dysregulation. And so those are all some things that come up.
Definitely. And another weird one too, the heart palpitations, the dryness, vaginal dryness that can make intimacy really challenging, skin dryness, hair dryness. I definitely noticed changes in my hair. Yes. Anxiety. Yeah. And I don't know if you had also heard about this, but, new symptom unlocked for me earlier, jaw pain. So yes. And there's something about just the dips in estrogen and how that influences certain jaw pain. And I don't know the medical kind of mechanism for all of that. But yeah, so apparently a new symptom unlocked with jaw pain as well. And so it's a very interesting kind of phenomenon, but I appreciate, like just hearing what some of those weird symptoms might be for people. I think I've also heard people talk about itching in their ears, which is something else that has been, quite different and potentially surprising for people. So,
what I wonder, now this might sound crazy, but I wonder, I remember several years ago going to get, this being a little TMI, going to get resized, measured for my bra.
Yeah.
The size went up. And then a few years later, it went up again and it went up again. Yeah. Is that related to it? Because that can really impact you, emotionally. Why is this happening when you were used to being a certain size and all of a sudden, your bra size is way bigger than what it used to be? Well, some people may like that, but I hear people actually cry. Because I know I broke down into something. Why didn't happen?
Yeah. Well, I'm also wondering too, if that has to do with kind of the redistribution of weight in our bodies that's associated with the changes in estrogen and how our bodies, are getting used to functioning with lower estrogen and, and especially if you're not necessarily doing any kind of hormone replacement or whatever, but they talk about just that weight gain around the middle and how that shifts. And I know that that thing that's happened a little bit more for me as to
yeah, I went from being this fitness always to now oh my God, no matter what you do, you eat right, you exercise, you do strength training, it's the scale, it's not budging. It can be real frustrating and comes with a lot of self-acceptance. How do you get to self-acceptance?
A lot, definitely. How do you think people feel going through perimenopause, and especially those in the infertility and loss communities?
Oh, that's such a stage of confusion, right? Mm-hmm. Because you're at this chapter where you're beginning a new chapter and the door is likely closing for most people on a chapter that maybe you had hoped for something. You hope to be able to be a parent, to carry whatever your journey is to parenthood, and this door is closing. So that feeling of loss, feeling of grief, the feeling of failure, the feeling of shame. I think shame is such a big part you're going through infertility because there's already the shame of infertility, my body's not doing what it's supposed to do. And that is my fault. What did I do wrong? To now this thing that is out of control. And that's the thing with perimenopause. Perimenopause is another area adding on to infertility where you have no control of the outcome is going to be. Now you're experiencing these symptoms that you really don't have control over. Control meaning I can't control that my hormones are fluctuating. I can't I can control the emotional once I understand it, but I cannot control the fact that I will feel anxious. So dealing with that sense of control is huge.
Mm-hmm.
My answer.
Yeah, well, and I think, just it sounds like there's just a whole host of feelings that people, will feel during this time. And, when we think about, the infertility and loss communities, there is a lot of uncertainty. And these are people that are still potentially on the path to parenthood. And when you are on the path to parenthood and you don't really want to hear how your reproductive window is closing, mm-hmm. You've experienced, so much heartache and loss and, and struggle. And so it makes sense that it would make people feel that much more anxious and just all of those other feelings that just get amplified. It's going to all.
And then if you think about it, this is probably the time when the doctors will start to introduce the idea of using donor gametes. But
yes.
For eggs, so what is that saying about if you're already dealing with anxiety or depression or grief, you're saying not even my gametes are good enough to allow me to have a genetic link to my offspring. So there's that aspect of it too when dealing with infertility.
Definitely. Just the experience of perimenopause in our community, because I think, as you mentioned, it's this large period of time before people make the ultimate transition to being in menopause, where basically it's a year without your period. Mm-hmm. And I think what also people might not understand is that it could last in upwards of 10 years for
Yeah.
And I know that information wasn't necessarily discussed in my community, but I'm curious in your experience, how has perimenopause or menopause been discussed in families or, communities, if at all, and particularly Black communities?
From my experience, it's similar to discussed. Like people, I think now more so being on social media that I'm sharing more about perimenopause, but I mean, my mom never talked to me about perimenopause. None of my aunts or anyone talked to me about perimenopause. So maybe just amongst girlfriends now who are like, oh, I think I'm at this stage in my life. So I find that it's something that, again, is in secrecy. And I think that's directly linked to shame, because shame of I'm changing. I'm not who I used to be. How do I now identify with who I am during this period? And there's something else I want to say. There's talking about your cycle. There are those who may have their regular cycle, like and may not experience any interruption in their cycle. So that's another thing, because if you're looking for the interruption in cycle and you don't have it, someone may say, oh, you're not going through perimenopause, but what other symptoms? Like we talk about what other symptoms that you have.
Right. Yeah. So much disruption that's not necessarily getting talked about. And so where did you start to learn about it? Like, and we start to think about where people getting information and where is it? Where did you get it? And where do you think it is now?
Now I'm trying to think. I really think it was when I started going through fertility treatments back in 2016. My doctor, he's passed away now, Dr. Boba, talked about perimenopause. And he's like, there's a peri before the menopause. Like, why is there always something with women? But I still didn't know. It was this idea that was floating and it was like far away from me. But I was actually in the age to be perimenopausal and didn't even know, because there's this idea that it starts in your 50s. And I'm like, oh, but I'm not there. So I don't have to worry about that. I'm not really trying at that age. But then only to recognize, oh, maybe some of these symptoms that I'm experiencing are related to perimenopause. Even though when I go to my doctors, which I've gone to several doctors over the years, and they're all like, oh, you're not in perimenopause. You have a few more years. So I'm like, well, now that I'm doing more research, like going and actually doing more research or listening to people talk about it. What is it? Have you heard of the Black Girl's Guide to, I think it's perimenopause or menopause? They have a whole network that they talk about perimenopause and how Black women experience it. So listening to things like that, I'm like, I think my doctors are not really accurate. I am definitely in perimenopause.
Yes. It's interesting that you mentioned that you first maybe heard of it when you were going through fertility treatments. And I remember my doctor mentioning that to me in terms of, when we were doing like a baseline ultrasound and she was looking at the antral follicle count and, and it was a little bit low for what we, would want, to be ideal to utilize fertility medications, but it might have been normal for my age. But I remember thinking like, oh, no, I don't really, this can't be. Like, yeah, but I think that's kind of where I started to hear about it, aside from just, like maybe television and just people talking about reference, just a distant reference. But where do you think people can maybe find that information or find that support around perimenopause or menopause now?
Well, I mean, now we're starting to have more people talk about it. Like, I think we're in a culture where when celebrities say things, like people listen. So I'm glad there are people who are using their platforms to talk about that. Like I mentioned, I think it's called the Black Girl's Guide to Menopause or Perimenopause. That's a network, but we can find different like social media groups that may talk more about perimenopause. And then I'm sure, what is it called? The CDC might have some information on perimenopause. And we might have some information on perimenopause. And now we might have to go overseas and look at some of those medical organizations in other countries, because no matter where you are, the fact is we're all experiencing these symptoms. It doesn't matter where you live. At some point, we're all experiencing these same symptoms. And some people would use like different trackers, there are probably some apps that you can use to track your symptoms. So that could be another. I was going to recommend this app, but then I saw a thing on it today. I was like, maybe I'm not going to recommend that.
Yeah, I know. Like these get a little nervous about, the our health information being on apps these days and not necessarily knowing where our data is going or how it's being used, especially with this, administration. Yeah, just a little caveat for people. You mentioned, in addition to just like where people might be able to access more information about perimenopause, I think that you had alluded to earlier in the fact just how this time of life in and of itself is really marred with this, not marred, but maybe characterized by a lot of shifts that one, kind of goes through. And this kind of shift in identity, personhood, womanhood, beauty or worth. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to how you see perimenopause shifting that one sense of self.
Yes. So this is a very vulnerable time. It's a very confusing time. It can feel a time that is out of your control. And so if you think about beauty, you might be comparing what you are now, who you are now, to who you were in your 20s, what you look like in your 20s, but your body's shifting. What does that say about you? So this is when acceptance comes in. Acceptance, because things that may have happened quickly in your 20s or 30s or even 40s, they may not be happening as quickly as they are. So when you think about the standard of beauty, where we live in a society where beauty is given to the youth, you have to be youthful to be considered beautiful. What does that do to you as an individual? So where do you find community, or where do you find things that can validate you internally when you're not looking for outside validation? What was the other thing? Just a sense of identity. It's also, like you said, like it's closing that chapter. Or what is it opening? I think we forget about the part about, okay, so I'm at this point in my life where things are shifting. But as things are shifting, what is birthing, for lack of a better word? Are there new things that I can discover about me as I go through this time? And how open am I to exploring those things? I think we have to really focus on exploring the new me. Who am I during this phase?
Exactly. And I think this is why it's so powerful to have more conversations, because the narrative around menopause was always so negative. Yeah. I liked what you just said about how, one chapter of one's life is, might be ending, but what else is getting birthed? And I think that's a lot of redefinition that goes into that process where you are like redefining your sense of worth outside of reproduction, outside of these beauty standards that are just sometimes really unattainable and unrealistic and unfair.
Yeah.
Recognizing there's a wholeness there. This is just and maybe, I'd like to think of it like a wisdom of lived experience that gets to inform this new process.
It's it's a vulnerable time, but it's a beautiful time if, like you said, there is acceptance of how do I embrace myself during this time? How do I show? We say this all the time, like show yourself grace, but really, how can I be gracious to myself during this time? Because I deserve to love me as my is changing and explore what new things are happening.
Exactly. And so this kind of makes me curious about what you think, or how you think this change, this transition kind of impacts like how people might show up in relationships with themselves or with their partners or with others. I know I have some ideas, but I want to, what your thoughts are about that.
I think it can go two ways. I think for those who may be more attached to the shame, they may go more inward, have less of a voice. So that part, they may, I would say, fall into themselves. You know what I mean? Because I don't know who I am. I'm not open to who this new part of me is. I want to hold on to what I've always known. And that can impact the relationship, because do you show up? How would you show up sexually, for instance? Are you going to be sexually free with your partner? Do you share with your partner what it is that you're experiencing, or is it something that is done in secret? And then there are those who are like, I'm going to embrace this moment of who I'm becoming. And so we can be more open, like, you know what? This is what is happening with me right now. When I lash out at you, maybe it was about this, and I need to identify, like, this is what's happening to me. It opens room for conversation. It opens room so your partner has insight into behavior. And it can also exploring new things. Like if your partner is aware, like, oh, sexually, I'm experiencing vaginal dryness. They can be like, okay, what can we learn together about this stage? How can we make things more comfortable when we are being intimate? So I think you have those two ways it can go for the relationships.
For sure, for sure. Just being really kind of transparent, and with that level of transparency and openness, it's really about trying to help people be more authentic in their connections too. And that you're able to be more authentic with yourself and then authentic with your partner. And then when you mentioned, I think earlier too, how this is like just such a vulnerable time, and I think about some people are, in kind of doing a lot of sandwiching in their parenting when they're taking care of older parents and then caring for younger parents too. And, so you have multiple kind of pulls on one's energy too, where, it's hard to maybe show up authentically or, but maybe part of it is just recognizing this is the best that you can do. But this is just, it's also really hard. It's a really hard time of life.
But I'm glad you said that, like recognizing this is the best that I can do. And it's part of people to accept like this is the best that I can do. And so there's that tendency to beat up on yourself if you don't show up as you used to show up. Maybe like if you're running, because now we have a lot of older parents. If you're running behind a 2-year-old and then you're taking care of an older parent, you're showing up 2 different ways in those 2 environments. So how do you bring that together? How can you ask for help during that time? Like I may not have the same energy, like recognizing like I may not have the same energy that I had 10, 15 years ago. Let's talk about this and be real as you deal with an older parent. And also having the patience. There's a different patience dealing with an older parent and there's a patience dealing with the younger person. So how do you put those hats on? And I always say to clients or friends like, hey, so this moment happened and you're beating up on yourself, but you did what you could do in that moment. You did what you thought was right. And if you did something that you feel like, I need to take accountability for this. How do you take accountability, whether it's to the parent or whether it's to your child? Like, how do you take accountability so they know where you were coming from and you can forgive yourself and give them room to say, you know what? It's okay. I don't agree that it happened. I don't like that it happened, but it's okay. And let's work through how we can work through this moving forward.
Right. Yes. How to kind of work on that and moving forward. And that also makes me think of like this stuff. Like, what do you think, like this is, we often talk about like, when people reach a certain age, they kind of come to these realizations. And I've often heard that like once people reach like, 40s or 50s, they're just like, like almost like this I don't care kind of attitude. But and I'm really oversimplifying it. But I guess my question is like, what is something that people maybe talk about releasing or reclaiming during, this season of life?
Oh, I think one big one that comes up with clients is perfectionism. There's this need to release perfectionism. Just like, we're having little glitches here and there. I'm feeling, oh my God, your internet's unstable, all kinds of stuff. But this release of accepting like, it's not perfect, but it's okay. I think we see a lot of that, people reclaiming that and people embracing their voice, being able to speak and say, this is my truth right now. This is what's going on with me. So we see that a lot. So we see this need to please, to acquiesce just to please someone else and really saying, no, this doesn't work for me, or negotiating better with loved ones and coming up with things that are not just that everyone feels a sense of equity in a final decision. I see that a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I love that.
Yeah, no, definitely. I appreciate that. Like, yeah, just, it's how people, I think kind of really that challenge of showing up differently, releasing kind of perfectionism and just embracing, where people are.
Yeah.
And, and that's okay. It's not about kind of putting forth this facade, but really taking off the mask and being okay with that.
Yeah. I love it. Remember that one will wear the mask. He has a different mask in different environments.
Yeah.
About that mask. Mm-hmm. And maybe finally starting to really see yourself and accept all the different sides of yourself and how they come together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. taking off the mask and being able to look at all sides and to see how they come together. And I think about just the beauty in that process of, again, being able to be that authentic with oneself and, and imagining that that's kind of a really grounded kind of experience. And I'm wondering, are there any other kind of ways that people feel grounded or, as they are or informed as they move through this transition?
I've been reading. I know there are a lot of evidence-based information. No, I shouldn't say a lot. There's evidence-based information out there. So doing the research, finding those, like finding something like this, like a podcast, like what's about perimenopause. And for some, it may be more of a lived experience. For some, it may be more of a medical experience of finding people who have education on that. So you feel not so alone, but also maybe listening, talking to your river friends, or, birthing people who have who are going through it, as opposed to this whole secret. Because I know when you have a sense of community, this sense of this is not an isolated situation. I'm not the only one experiencing it. There's this release like, oh, let's normalize it. If we normalize talking about this, like I was hosting a dinner a couple of months ago, and my cousin was like fanning, and I was like, I've never experienced a hot flash. Right? So I was like, what's going on? Yeah, she was like, it's my personal summer. I was like, oh Lord, we normalized it, and no one made a big deal over dinner that she was having I have another friend who was like, oh my God, during a certain time in my life, I couldn't wear makeup because makeup would run. And I'm like, oh, just slide off. So talking about those things and sharing information with friends, like, listen, this is what worked for me. You might want to try it. So I think when we can talk about it, that's grounding, because it gives you the power back, as opposed to existing in a world where you have no control and you have no information as to what is happening. You're trying to figure it out on your own.
Right. Just kind of working on it like you're in this silo, and information keeps us connected. Whereas, not having that access to information keeps us really isolated. Mm-hmm. And, so this makes me curious about if there's like one myth or misconception about perimenopause that you would want to set the record straight on, what would it be?
Everyone doesn't experience hot flash, night sweats, or irregular periods. They're expected to. Go to your doctor, because the questions they ask is like usually one of those three things. They know, and they're like, oh, you're not experiencing perimenopause. Maybe ask them about, well, what are some other symptoms that I could be experiencing that may not be typical? Because there are things that I'm noticing about my body that's happening. And also pay attention to what has maybe tracking your body. Like, what have you noticed that's been different in the few years than before? Like for me, joint pain. That was something I was like, well, why am I having joint pain? There were certain things I also needed to change in my diet because of the joint pain. So learn about what the symptoms are, so you're not just dismissed because you're not having the ones that people expect you to have.
Yes. No, that's a great myth to, I think, dispel. And I would like maybe add to that from maybe a non-medical side, because I think you kind of alluded to it as well. It's like there's a beautiful new chapter that kind of opens. Where you're really living from a place of wisdom and lived experience that I think can be a real gift. Yeah. And I heard someone say, I don't know if Halle Berry's been very vocal about this, and a lot of other celebrities that we might have looked up to, but it's like aging is a privilege. And when I heard that, my heart stopped, and I was just like, wow, because, I can't tell you how much we know in our society, we kind of value youth. And we know that people who identify as women age very differently than men. Men get to age gracefully, whereas typically women don't. So I think that's invited a lot of negative kind of perceptions about aging for women in particular, and just like how we look, and a wrinkle, are we wrinkly, and this, are we sagging, or what have you, and so I just feel like it's this season being about reclaiming, redefining, and when you think about the privilege to be able to do that when not everybody has afforded that was really humbling. And so that is another maybe little nugget myth kind of out there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to go back a little bit because one symptom, like two symptoms I think we didn't touch on were brain fog.
Oh, yeah.
And feeling unfatigued.
And sorry, feeling what?
Fatigue, yeah. And that brain fog, I think, is huge. I mean, it comes naturally with aging, but it is something to really come to terms with when you can't quite say that word. I know what the word is, but I can't quite put it. It's not coming to mind right now. That is something that is so common.
It is really common. And I appreciate you bringing that up because I think about just, a lot of how we're seeing a lot more older parents. And, and there are quite a few people who are welcoming their first child after 40 and even after 45. And so when you're really in the throes of perimenopause and you're dealing with the postpartum experience and the brain fog, is the brain fog related to postpartum? Is it related to just momming in general? Is it related to perimenopause or, some combination of the three? So, being mindful of that as well.
Yeah. That's such a big one. It's such a common.
Yeah, it is. It is. One thing I realized that we didn't talk a lot about or haven't, thus far is, how do people, when you're going through this, how do you kind of interface with or interact with the medical community? And so I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about how to encourage people to, maybe talk to their doctors or advocate for themselves in medical, settings and, or maybe supporting others in doing the same.
Wow. I mean, like you said, a lot of doctors have not been trained on this particular this women's health issue, this birthing, women and birthing people's health issue. And so maybe sometimes asking for a referral, asking your doctor, is there someone who I can speak to this may be their specialty. This is something that they focus on. And then you can also bring to their knowledge what you know about the different symptoms that you may be experiencing that from research you learn have been linked to perimenopause. I'm always saying if you're the type who maybe may find it difficult to speak up for yourself in certain settings, maybe you can take someone with you who can advocate on your behalf. And ask the doctors, well, can you document our conversation today? Can you document why we're not exploring these options? And what other options would you recommend that I explore if I'm going through this confusing time, since we can't really put a finger on what's going on?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think you said something that is really important for people to remember is if you are asking your doctor a question and they say, no, it's not a big deal or don't worry about it, or, they won't necessarily prescribe something or like a test, like maybe asking them why and maybe asking them to document why they didn't as well. So that there is, I think maybe a little bit more accountability for how they're going through their decision tree and to be as clear as possible, but also for there to be a little bit of a record as well in case there's something else that comes up where it would have made sense to, kind of have gone in a different direction and you didn't have any documentation about it, but now you do.
Exactly. And I think people say a lot of times when you ask the doctors to document, they may come up with other alternatives that they may not have brought up before. Of course, that's not the case with everyone, but like you said, you just want records, so you have something on record. So it also can give you a timeline from when something started happening. So you do move on to speak to another doctor. You have work about, okay, if I see you spoke to your doctor about this around this time, and maybe it didn't look like this time, but now we're at this stage, you'll also explore it from this point on.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, that's nice. That's nice. So I'm curious, any final thoughts or things that you would want, people to know about, as they are thinking about advocating for themselves or moving into this new phase of their lives?
I would say learn how perimenopause may be showing up for you as opposed to looking for the typical symptoms. Like you just mentioned, the jaw thing. I'm like, oh, I hadn't even heard of that one. So how is it showing up for you? And you may find out, more about that by maybe being in the community, of finding a community, like a Facebook group or whatever groups are out there that people are having these conversations, because then you can look at other lived experiences, but don't just go on that. do find evidence-based research. By that, we mean like it's been research by multiple doctors, it's been validated. So you're not just pulling stuff off Google, say, well, I saw this here, but really see what are multiple doctors saying about this, and then talk to your healthcare professional. Like I said, someone who is knowledgeable about menopause, because they may know so many more symptoms that we're just discovering as time goes on.
Right. Yeah. No, I think those are great. That's a great point. And I want to thank you for sharing your wisdom today with our listeners. And I feel like this is a great start of meaningful conversation that I hope will continue offline and in so many different circles. And I feel comfortable in saying this isn't our mother's menopause journey. And I'm really proud of the Gen Xers who are kind of, just pulling back the curtains and say, hey, this is what we're going through. And I don't know. I know that you're on TikTok as well. But to follow this woman, I first found out about her on TikTok, and I think she's on Instagram now, but she started the We Do Not Care Club.
Yes. She's making headlines. I love her because some people, I don't really care right now.
Exactly. And I think it's like that level of realness, and it's such a beautiful gift to to us, and it's funny. It's real. I can't think of her handle, but if you just, will back here, she is the president of the International We Do Not Care Club. There might be offshoots of it, but there is only one. And I feel like maybe Milani or something. I can't remember, but just Google that or search for that.
But to that point, that says so much about acceptance and like that becoming that you talked about, to say, this is happening. We do not care. I know we say it in jest, but it's just like, I have to accept this is what's going on with me right now. I can't be focused on what it used to be, why it's changing, why it's different. The fact is, it's happening. I have to accept it, and I can't care about it right now. I'm reminded.
Exactly. So I just want to thank you so much for joining us today. But I think it's important for people to make sure that they stay connected to you, Dr. Wiyatta. So where can people find you?
Okay, so for fertility, I'm on fertility counseling now. Fertility counseling now, one word, on Instagram, or you can go to my website. And then also for professional women going life changes, menopause, and all these different things, just at Dr. Wiyatta, at Dr. DrWiyatta. Find me on Instagram, on TikTok, on LinkedIn. Is there anything else? Facebook, all at Dr. Wiyatta.
Okay. No, thank you. And I think most importantly, it's so important for everyone to know that perimenopause doesn't have to be the end of something. It can be a shifting, and it's a very profound sense of becoming. And so as we think about this reclamation of our voices and this wisdom and this embodied truth that comes from this lived experience, I hope that people can hold on to that. This is a privilege for us. And so when I think about those of us in the Black community as well, and thinking about all that we carry and carry quietly, just know that there are lots of us out here, and you just have to there are lots of us out here, and you do not have to walk through this season alone. And so to anyone who's listening, who's in the midst of this change, you're not too much, you're not invisible. You're still becoming, and that is something to honor. Thank you for joining me today on The Layers We Live. And if today's episode resonated, I'd love if you would share this with a friend or leave a review. And if you're walking through your own layer journey, our doors are always open. And until next time, take care of yourself. And remember, you are not alone in the layers you carry. Okay.